The biggest thing happening with the Toronto Maple Leafs right now isn't a blockbuster trade. It isn't one superstar replacing another, and it isn't even the hiring of a new head coach. Here's what I'm hearing. The organization believes the biggest problem wasn't talent, it was identity. From what people around the league have been saying, nearly every major move this summer points toward one goal. The Maple Leafs aren't just trying to become a better hockey team, they're trying to become a completely different hockey team. And once you connect every decision they've made over the past few months, the picture starts to look very different from what most fans expected. For years, the conversation around Toronto has been almost identical every summer. The roster changes, a few veterans leave, new players arrive, expectations stay high. Then the playoffs arrive, and the same questions come back. Is the team mentally tough enough? Can they defend when games tighten up? Do they have enough depth? Are they built for playoff hockey? Those questions have followed this franchise for nearly a decade. This offseason, though, I'm told the organization stopped looking at individual problems and started looking at the entire system. Instead of asking which winger to sign or which defenseman to trade for, they asked something much bigger. What kind of hockey team do we actually want to be? That's a very different question, and I think that's where this story really begins. One of the clearest signs came in the front office. John Chaika was brought in to lead hockey operations as general manager, replacing Brad Treliving after another disappointing playoff exit. Chaika has a very different reputation around the league. He's known for combining traditional scouting with modern analytics, but people who have worked around him also describe him as someone who wants every department moving in the same direction. Here's how I read that decision. The Maple Leafs weren't simply looking for another experienced executive. They were looking for someone who could reshape the entire hockey department. That means scouting, player development, coaching, roster construction, even the way decisions are made behind closed doors. Shortly after arriving, Chaika wasted very little time making changes. Several members of the hockey operations department departed as part of the restructuring. New voices were brought into important positions. The goal, from what I've been told, wasn't change for the sake of change, it was an alignment. That word keeps coming up whenever people discuss what Toronto is trying to build. Alignment between management and coaching, alignment between player development and the NHL roster, alignment between the team's identity during the regular season and the identity it wants when playoff hockey begins. That's something many successful organizations around the league have spent years building. Florida has it, Vegas has it, Tampa Bay built it over time. Now Toronto appears to be trying to do the same. But front office changes alone don't create a new culture. That's where Jim Hiller enters the picture. When Toronto hired Hiller as head coach, the reaction around the league was interesting. Some fans immediately focused on systems. Others focused on his experience. But the conversations I kept hearing weren't really about X's and O's. They were about communication. People who have worked with Hiller consistently describe him as someone who demands accountability without losing the room. That's a difficult balance for any NHL coach. You need players to respect you. You need veterans to buy in. You need young players to keep developing. And perhaps most importantly in Toronto, you need star players to accept the same standards as everyone else. That's easier said than done. The Maple Leafs have never lacked talent. Very few people around hockey would argue that. The problem has always been turning elite talent into consistent playoff success. That's why Hiller's leadership style may matter even more than his systems. Here's what I'm hearing from people around the league. The expectation isn't that Hiller completely changes how Toronto plays overnight. The expectation is that he changes how players prepare, how they practice, how they compete, how they respond when momentum swings against them. Those things rarely show up on the score sheet, but they often decide playoff series. And that leads to another move that caught plenty of attention. Daniel Alfredsson joining the coaching staff. Now, this one says a lot. Alfredsson isn't arriving because he needs NHL experience. He's already earned enormous respect across hockey. He spent nearly 2 decades leading the Ottawa Senators. He captained teams through difficult playoff battles. He understands pressure better than almost anyone. He knows exactly what it feels like to carry expectations inside a Canadian market. That experience isn't something you teach. It's something you've lived. From what I've been told, bringing Alfredsson into the organization wasn't simply about adding another coach behind the bench. It was about adding another leadership voice inside the room. Every successful NHL team seems to have people who understand championship habits. Sometimes they're former players, sometimes they're coaches, sometimes they're executives. Toronto appears determined to surround its players with people who understand exactly what winning organizations look like every single day. And here's something I find especially interesting. When you look at every major move together, none of them seem designed to grab headlines. There hasn't been one giant splash designed to dominate free agency. Instead, nearly every decision has quietly pointed toward the same objective: build better habits, improve accountability, strengthen culture, create consistency. That's not nearly as exciting as signing a superstar, but it may end up being far more important. Because if there's one lesson the Maple Leafs have learned over the past several years, it's this: talent gets you into the playoffs. Identity helps you survive them. And that's where I think this offseason starts making much more sense. The coaching staff wasn't rebuilt in isolation. The front office wasn't reorganized by accident. Even the conversations surrounding player acquisitions appear connected to the same philosophy. I'm hearing that Toronto isn't simply looking for the most skilled players available anymore. They're looking for players who fit the identity they're trying to establish. That's an important difference. In previous years, the focus often centered around adding another scorer or another offensive weapon. This summer, the conversation sounds different. League sources indicate that character, competitiveness, defensive commitment, and versatility have become much bigger priorities during evaluations. That's exactly what championship organizations tend to emphasize. Look at recent Stanley Cup winners. Florida doesn't rely on one style of hockey. Vegas didn't either. Those teams can score. They can defend. They can play physically. They can adapt when a series changes. Toronto appears determined to build that same flexibility, instead of depending almost entirely on offensive talent. Whether that works remains to be seen. But I don't think anyone can argue the organization is simply repeating the same formula. Because this feels like something much bigger than another offseason. It feels like an attempt to redefine what it means to be a Toronto Maple Leaf. That last point may be the most important one of all, because changing an identity is much harder than changing a roster. You can sign free agents in July. You can hire a coach in one afternoon. You can make a trade with a single phone call. But creating a new culture inside an NHL organization, that usually takes months, sometimes years. And here's what I'm hearing. The Maple Leafs know that. Nobody inside the organization expects this transformation to happen overnight. Instead, every move they've made suggests they're laying the foundation for something they hope will last far beyond one season. One thing that stands out to me is how different the messaging has been compared to previous years. In the past, most conversations centered around talent. Could Toronto add another top six forward? Did they need another puck-moving defenseman? Would one more scoring winger finally push them over the top? This offseason, the discussion sounds very different. From what I've been told, the organization has spent just as much time talking about habits, preparation, accountability, and consistency as it has about skill. Those aren't flashy words, but they're the kind of words you hear from teams that expect to compete deep into the playoffs. And honestly, that's where I think this story becomes much bigger than hockey systems. It's about expectations. For years, the Maple Leafs have carried one of the heaviest pressures in professional sports. Every losing streak becomes front-page news. Every playoff exit sparks weeks of debate. Every offseason is filled with predictions that this year will finally be different. Eventually, that pressure can shape how an organization thinks. Here's how I read the situation. Toronto seems to have realized that constantly chasing the next quick fix wasn't solving the bigger issue. Instead of searching for one magical roster move, they're trying to create an environment where success becomes part of the daily standard. That may sound simple. In reality, it's incredibly difficult. Look across the NHL. The organizations that consistently compete for championships usually share one thing in common. They know exactly who they are. The Florida Panthers have built an identity around relentless pressure, physical play, and depth throughout the lineup. The Vegas Golden Knights established a culture where every player understands his role, regardless of whether he's a star or a fourth-line forward. Even teams that fall short in certain seasons rarely abandon that identity. They adjust around it. That's what Toronto appears to be chasing now. Not a single system, not one style of offense. An organizational identity that survives coaching changes, roster turnover, injuries, and difficult stretches during the season. And that's why I don't think the hiring of Daniel Alfredsson should be overlooked. Most fans naturally focus on the head coach. That's understandable. But associate coaches often spend enormous amounts of time working directly with players, especially away from the spotlight. Alfredsson brings something that's difficult to measure on a stat sheet: credibility. He understands what leadership looks like because he lived it throughout nearly 2 decades in the NHL. He understands what it's like to wear the captain's C, to handle constant media attention, and to lead teammates through both success and disappointment. Here's what I'm hearing from people around the league. His role isn't simply to run drills or draw up systems. It's to reinforce the standards the organization wants every player to follow. That influence matters, especially inside a market like Toronto. Then there's Jim Hiller. As training camp gets closer, one question keeps coming up. How different will this team actually look once the puck drops? My take is that the biggest changes probably won't show up during the first week of the season. Instead, watch how the team responds after losses. Watch how they defend late in close games. Watch how often forwards support their defensemen. Watch whether the same mistakes continue happening over and over. Those are usually the first signs that a coaching staff is changing behavior rather than simply changing tactics. League sources indicate Hiller has earned respect throughout his coaching career by emphasizing details that often go unnoticed by casual fans. Line changes, defensive positioning, puck support, competing through all 3 zones. Those habits may not produce highlight reel moments every night,